Welcome to Seriously Sus, the podcast that exposes shadiness with a side eye, hosted by Nanette and Miranda. And we're here to uncover true crime trends and internet chaos that makes you question everything. So get your side eye ready, because things are about to get seriously sus.
Now, before we start, a warning. This episode discusses severe neglect, starvation, and death. Listener discretion is advised. If this topic is distressing, please check out our show notes and resources for support. Welcome to Seriously Sus, the podcast that exposes shadiness with a side eye. Whether it's crime, culture, the kind of stories that make you stop and say, wait, didn't that just happen? I'm Miranda.
And I'm Nanette. Every week we dig into cases and controversies that don't sit right. The ones where the official story feels incomplete and the explanation feels thin, and the truth is way darker than people want to admit.
And today, we're starting with a topic that's deeply uncomfortable, but incredibly important. Because the stories we're talking about today, they don't usually start with violence. They start quietly, behind closed doors, with excuses.
We're asking a chilling question. When does starvation cross the line from neglect to murder? Because when people hear the word starvation, they often picture famine, war zones, or extreme poverty. What they don't picture is a child or a disabled adult starving to death inside a home with food nearby, with caregivers present. And that's the part that makes it so hard to wrap your head around. These aren't cases where no one could help. These are cases where someone was responsible for helping and didn't, or worse, chose not to.
Before we go any further, we do want to be clear. This episode discusses severe neglect, starvation, and death. If that's something you're not in a place to hear right now, please take care of yourself. Your mental state is the most important here. We've included resources in the show notes for anyone who may need them. But if you're staying with us, here's why this conversation matters. Because these cases force us to confront something uncomfortable. That harm doesn't always look violent. Sometimes it looks like inaction, delay, control, and silence. Setting the stage. Starvation isn't just about food. It's about control, isolation, power. These cases aren't sudden acts of rage or impulse. They're slow. They unfold over months, sometimes years, through patterns of neglect that end in death. That slowness is part of what makes them so dangerous. Because when the harm happens gradually, it's easier for people on the outside, like neighbors, teachers, even doctors, to miss it. Or explain it away. Especially when caregivers offer these justifications like, oh, they're a picky eater. Or they don't like doctors. Their disability makes things complicated. Over time, those excuses pile up and no one intervenes.
And here's something that stopped us cold while researching this case. In multiple instances, the people accused of starving their dependents were visibly well-fed. In some cases, they were obese, while the person in their care was wasting away. That contrast matters because it tells us this isn't about scarcity. It's not about not having enough. It's about who gets access and who doesn't. Food becomes a tool, a reward, or a punishment, and a way to assert control over someone who can't fight back.
And that's where the line starts to blur. Because if someone is completely dependent on you for survival, and you repeatedly deny them what they need, at what point does it even stop being neglect? At what point does it just become intentional harm?
In this episode, we're going to walk through several real cases involving children and disabled adults where starvation wasn't an accident, it was a pattern. And in some of these cases, the legal system ultimately called it what it was: homicide. We'll talk about the psychology behind these crimes, the warning signs that often go unnoticed or ignored, and how prosecutors decide when neglect crosses into murder.
Because these stories aren't just tragic, they're instructive. They show us how easily abuse can hide behind caregiving and how deadly our silence can be. Case Deep Dives. Wisconsin Teen House of Horrors. We're starting in Wisconsin. And this is the case that prosecutors would later describe as the House of Horrors. But like so many of these stories, it didn't begin with flashing lights or police tape. It began with a phone call.
In August of 2025, a man named Walter Goodman called 911. He told the dispatcher that his teenage daughter was lethargic, unresponsive, and that something was wrong.
At first, that sounds like a medical emergency, and it was. But what first responders walked into that day would quickly turn from a health crisis into a criminal investigation.
When emergency crews arrived at the house, they found a 14-year-old girl who weighed just 35 pounds. Let that number sink in for a second. 14 years old, 35 pounds. Doctors later said she looked closer in size to a 6-year-old than a teenager. She was described as extremely frail, weak, barely responsive. Paramedics rushed her out of the home and airlifted her to Children's Wisconsin.
At the hospital, doctors diagnosed severe malnutrition, dehydration, and multi-organ failure. This wasn't a sudden illness. Medical staff said her body showed signs of long-term starvation. This was one of the hardest things for people to understand about starvation cases. The body just doesn't shut down all at once. It adapts. It sacrifices. It starts shutting off the system slowly, trying to survive. Doctors later said her organs were failing because they've been deprived for so long. This wasn't about missing a few meals. This was about prolonged deprivation over months, possibly years.
As investigators started asking questions, a disturbing picture began to emerge. The girl hadn't seen a doctor in 5 years. She wasn't enrolled in school. She wasn't being seen regularly by teachers, counselors, coaches, any of the people who are legally required to report concerns. In other words, she'd almost been cut off completely from the outside world. And that isolation matters, because isolation is what allows abuse to continue unnoticed. When no one's checking in, no one is seeing the warning signs.
Right, so who's responsible for her care? According to the prosecutors, 4 adults in the home were charged. Her father, Walter Goodman, her stepmother, Melissa Goodman, Savannah Lefevre, the stepmother's daughter, and Kayla Stemler, Savannah's partner. All 4 adults, they were regularly present in the home, and all 4 of them, the prosecutors say, had responsibility for this child.
Here's a detail investigators couldn't ignore, and it's one we're going to come back through this episode. In court filings, prosecutors noted that multiple adults in the home were obese, while teenagers in their care were starving. That contrast is important because this isn't a household without food. This wasn't a situation where no one had access to nutrition. This is a situation where access was controlled.
Prosecutors used strong language early on. They described the home as a house of horrors. And when the prosecutors use language like that, it's usually because the conditions they observed were really extreme. Not just sad, not just neglect, but shocking. While many details are being protected because of the victim's age, and it's an ongoing case, authorities were clear that it wasn't like a momentary lapse. This was a pattern.
All 4 adults were charged with chronic neglect of a child, causing great bodily harm and emotional damage. 2 defendants, Savannah Lefevre and Kayla Stemler, have pleaded not guilty with a trial scheduled for August 2026. Walter and Melissa Goodman faced arraignments in January. There's no verdict yet in their case, but prosecutors have already made their position clear. This was not accidental neglect. This was prolonged, knowing deprivation.
And this is where the question starts to get uncomfortable. Because if a child is slowly starving inside your home for years and you do nothing, what is that? If you isolate them from doctors, from school, from anyone who might notice, is that neglect or is that something more?
This case forces us to confront how society defines violence. Because here, there were no signaling blows, no sudden attack, just a long series of choices, or non-choices, that nearly ended a child's life.
And as horrific as this case is, it's not unique. Because the next story shows what happens when starvation isn't just about control, but about profit.
Florida disabled child, starvation for profit. This next case takes us to Florida, and if the first story was about control and isolation, this one adds another layer that's deeply unsettling. Because here, starvation wasn't just neglect. Prosecutors say it was profitable. The victim was a 7-year-old boy with significant medical needs. He had spina bifida and hydrocephalitis, conditions that made him completely dependent on adults for feeding, hydration, and medical care. This wasn't a child who could go grab food on his own. Survival required daily, active intervention.
When the boy died, investigators said he weighed just 7 pounds. 7 pounds. You know how crazy it is? My daughter was 6 pounds when she was born, and she was small. Like, to put that in perspective, that's less than the average weight of a newborn. Like, this is a 7-year-old child. Medical examiners, they concluded that his death was caused by starvation. And almost immediately, authorities began asking the same question we've all been asking throughout this episode. How does this happen when caregivers are present?
As investigators searched the home, they found something that changed the entire trajectory of the case. There were 264 unopened bottles of prescribed feeding formula inside the house. This wasn't food that hadn't arrived yet. It wasn't a supply chain issue. It wasn't a misunderstanding. The nutrition was there. It just wasn't being given to the child. That discovery is crucial because it removes one of the most common defenses in neglect cases, lack of resources. Prosecutors say this child wasn't starving because there was nothing to feed him. He was starving because someone chose not to.
Monster. As this investigation unfolded, the list of suspects expanded far beyond a single caregiver. Authorities charged the child's mother, his brother, his grandfather, a nurse, and a Medicaid provider. This wasn't a case of just like an overwhelmed parent. Prosecutors allege this was a network of adults, all of whom had some level of responsibility for this child's care, and all of whom failed him. Charges included first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, manslaughter, and Medicaid fraud.
And this is where the case takes a darker turn. According to federal prosecutors, while the child was being starved, Medicaid claims were still being submitted for his care. Authorities alleged the defendants continued collecting money intended to support the child, money that covered medical care, feeding assistance, and supervision. The estimated value of the fraudulent claims ranged from $10,000 to $50,000. So while the child's body was wasting away, the system designed to protect him was being exploited.
Because of that, the case didn't stay in the realm of neglect. Prosecutors brought first-degree murder charges along with aggravated child abuse, manslaughter-related counts, and the Medicaid fraud. This wasn't like framed as accidental neglect or caregiver burnout, as it's so often tried to be framed. It was framed as intentional deprivation tied to financial gain. And this distinction matters because legally, motive helps establish intent. And these suspects have been indicted and they're awaiting trial in federal court.
What makes this case so shocking is how blatant it is. Hundreds of unopened formula bottles, ongoing payments, multiple adults involved. But what makes it familiar is its pattern. The child was medically fragile. He was dependent. He was largely invisible to the outside world. The people responsible for him controlling not only his care, but access to anyone who might intervene.
Yeah, this case also forces like a larger conversation about like the systems that are supposed to safeguard these vulnerable people. Because, I mean, how did it continue as long as it did? Multiple checkpoints they had to fail. Like there had to be medical oversight, home health monitoring, Medicaid compliance, mandatory reporting. At every stage, someone checked a box and the child continued to starve.
What's especially hard to sit with here is the role of choice, because starvation doesn't happen all at once. Every day, someone decided not to feed him, not to intervene, not to stop collecting money. This wasn't a bad single decision. It was a series of decisions repeated until there was nobody left to sustain. And that's why prosecutors don't hesitate to use the word murder.
And while this child's story involved money, the next case shows how starvation can happen even without a financial motive. When disability and neglect collide, the system looks away.
Cadaris Maddox, Tennessee. This next case takes us to Clarksville, Tennessee, and it's one that stayed in the court systems for years before there was any resolution. It also forces us to sit with the really uncomfortable truth. Sometimes starvation is obvious, documented, and still allowed to continue. Cadaris Maddox was 13 years old. He had cerebral palsy and required care, supervision, and regular medical attention. But doctors who knew him testified that he was cognitively intact. He understood what was happening around him. He communicated in his own way. And the people who worked with him said he was hopeful about his future.
On July 6, 2022, first responders were called to the home of Virginia Terrace. When they arrived, they found Kadaris dead. According to medical examiner, he weighed just 35 pounds. 13 years old, 35 pounds. The autopsy concluded that Kadaris died from malnutrition, and his matter of death was ruled a homicide. Doctors testified that his organs were shrinking because his body had been so deprived of nutrition for so long. His body had essentially been forced to prioritize survival of the brain and heart while everything else was shutting down.
Investigators described the home in severe disarray. Trash covered the floors. Kadaris' room was empty, a mattress, bedding, and very little else. What stood out here just wasn't the condition of the house, but how isolated Kadaris had become. Despite his medical needs, he wasn't receiving consistent care. Appointments were missed, outside eyes weren't seeing him regularly, and the isolation mattered because multiple witnesses later testified that they were concerned about his weight loss and deterioration, but those concerns never resulted in meaningful intervention.
Kadaris' mother, Cheyenne Dawn Maddox, denied intentionally harming her son. She said she loved him. She said she didn't wake up one day and decide to stop caring for him, but prosecutors didn't argue that. But prosecutors didn't argue that starvation required a single moment of intent. They argued that it required just repeated failure. They pointed to the testimony from medical professionals and caregivers who said Kadaris was not getting enough food, visibly wasting away, and was not receiving the care he needed, and that his mother was the one legally responsible for feeding him. The prosecutor said it plainly in court. He starved to death, according to the medical examiner.
Cheyenne Maddox was initially charged with first-degree murder and aggravated child neglect. The case went to trial in October 2025. After days of testimony and 2 days of jury deliberation, the jury returned a mixed verdict. They found her guilty of reckless homicide and guilty of aggravated child neglect. They did not convict her on first-degree murder, but they rejected the idea that this was an accident and unavoidable medical outcome.
Oh, you think?
Yeah.
In February 2026, Cheyenne Maddox was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Not enough if you ask me. The sentence included 3 years for reckless homicide and 17 years for aggravated child abuse, to be served congruently. During the sentencing, the judge acknowledged that it's not just the mother's actions, but a broader failure of the system, including child services, that occurred shortly before Kadaris died, but it didn't stop the harm.
This case matters because it shows how starvation doesn't require secrecy to be deadly. There were professionals involved. There were visits. There were concerns raised. And still, a child wasted away until his body couldn't survive. It also matters because a jury was asked to decide something very specific. Not whether Kadaris was loved, but whether his caregiver acted with reckless disregard for his life. And the jury said yes.
And as devastating as this case is, the next one shows us what happens when starvation doesn't end with a child, but follows someone into adulthood, long after the law assumes they should be able to protect themselves.
Tylim Hatchett, Pennsylvania. This case is one of the hardest in the entire lineup because it destroys the idea that starvation deaths are something that only happen to children. Tylim Hatchett was 21 years old. He was legally an adult, and he was completely dependent on other people to stay alive. Timlin was blind, he was nonverbal, he used a wheelchair, he had cerebral palsy, and he required round-the-clock care. He could not feed himself. He could not manage medications. He could not advocate for himself in any meaningful way.
And on the evening of September 18th, 2024, police were called to an apartment complex in Dresher, Pennsylvania. The call came in just before 8 p.m., a report of an unresponsive person. When officers arrived, they found Tyler lying on the floor. He was described as severely emaciated. He weighed just 59 pounds. 21 years old, 59 pounds. The medical examiner later ruled his death a homicide, as they should. The cause was listed as complications from cerebral palsy and the setting of neglect, so starvation.
One detail that stood out immediately to investigators was the timeline. Timlin's father, Vernon Hatchett, was at the apartment when the police arrived. He told officers he found his son unresponsive about 2 hours earlier and didn't call 911 right away.
What?
Yeah, that delay became part of the criminal investigation because when someone is completely dependent on you, time matters.
2 hours?
I have thoughts on the parents. And
they're unresponsive 2 hours.
Right. And in all these cases, the parents, in all these cases, the medical examiner. The homicide, you think?
Right. Yeah.
The minute you weigh them, like the minute you see them.
Yeah, it's clearly intentional. It takes a long time to do this. As detectives began reconstructing, like, the months leading up to Tillin's death, the picture became even more disturbing. From February 2024 to September 2024, he lost 31 pounds, dropping from 91 pounds to 59 pounds in roughly 7 months. Court records show that during the last 18 days of his life, Tillin was left alone in the apartment for 356 out of the 425 hours. That's more than 80% of the time. He wasn't being fed, he wasn't being given his prescribed medications, he was essentially abandoned inside his own home.
This case also includes a financial component that prosecutors say shows intent. Timlin's mother, Sherilyn Hawkins, and a family friend, Loretta Harris, were both receiving money through a home health care agency. They were submitting hours for care they were not providing. Investigators used cell phone data, building access records, and location tracking to show that the caregivers were not with Ty Lim when they claimed to be. Despite receiving thousands of dollars intended for his care, Tim Lim went without food, water, and medication for long stretches of time.
Prosecutors charged 3 people in connection with Lim's death. His mother, Sherilyn Hawkins, she was charged with third-degree murder and neglect to care of a dependent person, theft by deception, and conspiracy to commit theft. His caregiver, Loretta Harris, she was charged with neglect of a care-dependent person and a theft-related offense, and his father, Vernon Hatchett, was charged with neglect of a care-dependent person resulting in death, abuse of a care-dependent person, and conspiracy to commit involuntary manslaughter.
I don't think any of these are involuntary. This is all premeditated murder.
Voluntary.
Premeditated murder. I don't agree with any of these.
And it's not manslaughter. It's murder. You did it. You thought about doing it. You planned
You
it.
actively
It was not
did
an accident.
it. Yeah.
You can't
actively
accidentally do this.
starved. Yeah.
You don't accidentally starve someone to death.
Yeah. In October 2025, Sherilyn Hawkins pled guilty. She was sentenced to 25 to 50 years in state prison. Loretta Harris also pleaded guilty to lesser charges and was sentenced to 5 years probation. As of early 2026, Vernon Hatchett has not been arrested. Authorities have issued a warrant and increased a reward for his information leading to his capture to $10,000.
So if any of you guys know anything, turn that mofo in.
Yep.
Get you your $10,000. Put it behind bars.
Right.
Tillin didn't starve because no one knew he needed help. He starved while people were being paid to care for him. This is what starvation looks like when it happens in plain sight. It's not hidden by sorcery. It's by paperwork. He was an adult, but he was still completely dependent. And the people who were supposed to protect him, people who had total control over whether he lived or died, they neglected him. And it wasn't a neglect because of ignorance. It wasn't burnout or confusion. It was prolonged abandonment. Documented, measured, and repeated. Timothy Ferguson, Michigan. This next case is one where the legal system didn't hesitate. There was no debate on whether starvation could be considered murder.
There never should be.
There shouldn't. And the jury heard the evidence, they looked at what happened, and they called it exactly that. Timothy Ferguson was 15 years old. He had developmental disabilities, and he depended on the adults in his life to meet his basic needs. He lived in Michigan with his mother, Shonda Van Der Ark. And by the time Timothy died in July of 2022, prosecutors said he's been slowly starved inside his home.
When Timothy's body was examined, the number that stood out immediately was his weight. He weighed 69 pounds. A 15-year-old boy weighing 69 pounds. The medical ruled his death a homicide. The cause was malnutrition combined with hypothermia. Doctors testified that his body showed clear signs of prolonged starvation, not sudden illness, not a temporary loss of appetite, but long-term deprivation.
Oh, how many of them say, they just don't like to eat? Nobody's going to starve themselves to death. Come on.
Right.
This case didn't hinge on whether food was available either. Prosecutors presented evidence that Timothy was intentionally denied access to food. They described locked refrigerators and cabinets. I mean, this deprivation went on over time. It wasn't just a few missed meals. The state argued that Timothy was punished through hunger, that food was controlled and restricted and withheld. The prosecutors didn't frame this as neglect due to confusion or lack of resources. They framed it as torture by starvation, as they should have.
All of these cases should have been that, because that's 100% what it is.
It's monstrous.
The defense tried to argue that Timothy's mother didn't fully grasp the harm she's causing.
Bullshit.
How do you not see your child?
You're hungry, you're not like, maybe my kid's hungry?
You're locking the refrigerator. You knew you were causing harm. Like, you don't see your child starving there every day? She said they suggested she didn't understand the severity of his condition. Are you kidding me?
She has eyes, correct?
Right? But the jury heard testimony about Timothy's appearance, how visibly emaciated he was, and about how his body had shut down because it had been deprived for so long. And the argument that her lawyers were making didn't land.
Oh yeah, they saw right through her. They knew she was full of shit. So, in December of 2023, after a trial that included medical testimony and evidence of prolonged deprivation, a Michigan jury found Shonda Vander Ark guilty of murder and child abuse. Thank goodness.
Right?
But the jury concluded that starvation in this case was intentional and fatal. Under Michigan law, the conviction carried a mandatory life sentence. Shonda Vander Ark was sentenced to life in prison.
As that's the way it should be for all states and every one of these incidents.
Certainly better than the probation. Probation.
Mm-hmm. This case forces us to confront something uncomfortable. You don't need to have a weapon to commit murder. Sometimes all it takes is control and time. And while this case ended with one of the strongest possible legal outcomes, which we think they all should have, this final case shows how starvation can be framed as care for years until a judge finally says no more.
Okay, so the last case is one that really messes with people's assumptions about what care looks like. Because on paper, this mother and an adult daughter were living together. Like, it was a home setting, the kind of situation that people instinctively just trust more than an institution. Cora was 23 years old. Investigators said she was severely autistic, and her mother, Amy, she had been her legal guardian and her sole caretaker.
This case begins officially on January 4th, 2023, with a 911 call made by Amy. She told authorities she had found her daughter dead in bed. Deputies responded to their condo and found Cora under blankets. Now here's where the details start to feel physically hard to hear. Investigators described Cora as extremely thin, with sunken eyes and cheeks. The Waukesha Medical Examiner's Office later reported that Cora, who was 5 feet 5 inches, weighed only 70 pounds at the time of her death. Medical records showed she weighed 135 pounds about 7 years earlier. The medical examiner didn't label this an accident. Well, why would he?
Right.
The death was determined to be a homicide, specifically because, in their view, Cora wasn't given adequate food and water under her mother's care. Again, that's a no-brainer.
No shit.
Man.
So, what makes this one different from the other cases is that it doesn't center around a chaotic household with multiple adults coming and going, or there's no obvious fraud scheme with paperwork flying everywhere. This one is quieter. It's contained. And that's exactly why it's so disturbing. Because this kind of situation can just vanish from the public view without anyone noticing. Investigators said Cora had not left her condo since the COVID-19 pandemic. That detail matters because it speaks to isolation. Not just social isolation, but practical isolation. If someone isn't going to appointments, if, they They aren't in school, they aren't going to any programs, they aren't being seen by any outside professionals. It means that there are fewer checkpoints and fewer people that could see it and say, hey, something's wrong here. And that's a theme we've really hit again and again, is this starvation happens under, like, caregiving. It's often through isolation. That seems to be, like, the key takeaway from this. That's how the control works. They control access, food, they control access to medication, and they control access to the outside world. So basically to help.
Legally, the charge here is also important because it's very specific. Prosecutors charged Amy with recklessly subjecting an individual at risk to abuse under circumstances causing death. That's a state way of framing it as not just failure, but an abuse of a responsibility, a breach so severe it caused death. Amy was charged in 2023 and the case moved toward trial, but it never got there. In January 2025, she entered what's called an Alfred plea.
Bullshit.
Right? And the reason we mention this is because it's one of those legal terms people hear and don't always understand. An Alfred plea lets the defendant maintain they're not admitting guilt, but acknowledge that the state likely has enough evidence to convict at trial. It avoids trial, but results in a conviction. And the plea hearing had a clear reality underneath it. Prosecutors were preparing to lay out a case that Cora's starvation and dehydration were foreseeable and preventable, and the person responsible did not intervene.
Then comes the sentencing. This is where the court's language tells you how seriously the judge viewed what happened. On March 20th, 2025, Amy was sentenced to 20 years in prison, followed by 15 years of extended supervision. Reporting noted that it was more time than the state requested, and the judge rejected the defense's request of probation.
Good judge.
Obviously, at least this judge was paying,
Right?
freaking mind for the victims here. During the sentencing, the judge compared the autopsy photos of Cora to images from World War II concentration camps. That's not a comparison judges make lightly.
Mm-hmm.
It's a signal that the court saw the condition of the victim as really extreme and unmistakable. You also hear like this courtroom tug-of-war that happens a lot in caregiver cases. Family members are speaking up. The defense is trying to frame it as the caregivers are just like overwhelmed. The prosecutors are pushing back, saying, oh, their vulnerability makes it worse. Yes, of course it does.
Right?
Prosecutor Christy Gordon described the case as extremely aggravated because Cora has special needs.
And the defense argument here is one you've heard variations of in a lot of cases. The suggestion that the victim could have eaten on their own, could have gotten food, could have done more. In this case, the defense attorney argued that Cora could have gotten up and gotten food on her own. But the court didn't accept that framing, and the reason is backed into what prosecutors and the medical examiner were saying. Cora was an individual at risk. She was a dependent, and when someone is legally responsible for that level of care, you don't get to step back and say, well, technically, she might have been able to do it. Not when the outcome is 70 pounds. Not when the medical examiner is calling it a homicide. Not when evidence shows prolonged deprivation.
Yeah, like clearly she couldn't just do it.
Right.
This case is such a brutal capstone for the episode because it hits the heart of your main question. When does neglect become murder? Sometimes the difference isn't a dramatic moment. It's a slow acclimation of missed chances. Missed appointments, missed interventions, missed days where someone should have said, this is not okay. And then one day, a 911 call comes too late. And when a judge looks through the photographs and says essentially, this is what starvation looks like, it forces everyone listening to admit something. Starvation is violence. It just takes longer.
And I don't even think there's a question of when does neglect become murder. It becomes murder when someone dies.
It really does. And it should not be manslaughter. I hate when they say
It should not be manslaughter.
It's
murder.
It's not
or
accidental.
reckless endangerment of a child resulting in death. No, it's murder.
Murder.
Yes. So when we talk about Cora, we're not just talking about one caregiver and one victim. We're talking about how easily it can be for extreme neglect to hide behind the label of caregiving, especially when disability and isolation are involved, and how the legal system is apparently finally increasingly willing to say, no, this crossed the line.
When you line this up with the other cases, the control, the isolation, the excuses, the systems that didn't catch it, you start to see the same pattern from different angles, which brings us to a bigger question. What is happening psychologically in the people who do this? Like, why do so many warning signs get ignored?
Psychological profiling. Before we move any further, we need to pause and think about what's exactly happening in these cases. Not legally, not procedurally, but psychologically. Because if you look only at the facts, it's easy to ask the wrong question. People tend to ask, why didn't you just feed them? Well, I think that's kind of the right question, but that question assumes this is about forgetting ignorance or being overwhelmed.
Yeah, not that these people are monsters.
Yeah. What the psychology tells us is something different entirely. Starvation in caregiver situations is rarely about not knowing what to do. It's about control, isolation, and rationalization. And those three things show up in every case we've talked about. To put it in perspective, Dr. Maria Chang, a clinical psychiatrist who studies chronic neglect, says, neglect cases often involve deliberate avoidance of medical professionals. That's not ignorance, it's strategy. When caregivers isolate victims, they're creating an environment where the abuse can go unchecked.
One of the most important things to understand is that starvation doesn't look like violence in the way people expect it to look. There's no single moment where everything changes. There's no obvious breaking point. Psychologists and child development researchers describe neglect, especially chronic neglect, as persistent absence of responsive care. That phrase matters. Persistent absence over time. In the Wisconsin case, that looked like years without medical care or school. In the Florida case, it looked like feeding supplies just sitting around untouched while the child wasted away. In the Pewaukee case, that looked like a young woman just isolated in her condo for years, slowly losing half of her body weight. This is slow harm, and slow harm is a lot easier to normalize.
Another pattern that shows up again and again is coercive control, which is a concept most people associate with domestic violence. But it applies here too. Coercive control is about limiting someone's access to basic needs and to other people while convincing yourself and others you're doing it for their own good. Think about how often we heard that language. They don't like doctors. Talking about weight upsets them. They're difficult to feed. They don't understand hunger the way we do. Those aren't explanations. They're rationalizations. And rationalization is one of the strongest psychological tools people use to avoid confronting harm. In the Pewaukee case, the mother said she didn't want to upset her daughter by addressing weight. In the Tennessee case, the defense tried to argue emotions were clouding judgment, not facts. In the Michigan case, the defendant suggested the caregiver didn't understand the harm.
What a load of shit.
Yep. Psychologically, these explanations serve one purpose. They allow the caregiver to maintain control without seeing themselves as an abuser.
Isolation is what allows these starvation cases to continue. Abuse research continuously shows that isolating a victim from friends, professionals, schools, doctors, or social services dramatically increases risks of severe harm because the isolation controls the narrative. When there's no one else to see the body, the decline can be explained away. When no one checks in, there's no external reality to push back against the caregiver's story. Look at how isolation played out in these cases. There was no school, no routine doctor's visits, no consistent home health oversight. There were missed appointments, canceled services. The isolation doesn't just have to mean locking someone in a room, although in some of these cases it did. It just means making sure no one else has enough information to help and intervene.
Disability is one of the strongest risk factors for starvation-related neglect, and that's not speculation. It's documented across child welfare, elderly abuse, and forensic psychology research. People with disabilities are more likely to be dependent on caregivers for food and hydration, isolated from peers and professionals, disbelieved when something feels wrong, and framed as difficult rather than harmed. When a caregiver begins to resent the responsibility or feel entitled to control, that resentment can quietly turn to deprivation. And that's why prosecutors often say disability makes the case more aggravated, not less. Vulnerability increases responsibility.
One of the most common misconceptions in cases like this is just extreme caregiver burnout. And while caregiver stress is real, research makes it clear that there's a distinction between stress and chronic neglect. Burnout leads to mistakes. Chronic neglect is a pattern. Chronic neglect shows up as repeated failure to meet basic needs, escalating isolation, missed opportunities to get help. Just rationalizations that become way more elaborate over time. In the Tillum Hatchet case, caregivers weren't just overwhelmed, they were collecting money while leaving him alone. In the Michigan case, food access was actively restricted. In the Florida case, formula was stockpiled, not used. These are not burnout behaviors, they're control behaviors.
And another uncomfortable truth is the systems are not built to catch slow harm. Child protective services, medical systems, even law enforcement are often looking for acute injury, not gradual deterioration. Research on chronic neglect shows that repeated low-level red flags are often treated as separate incidents, instead of a single escalating pattern. So when people ask, how did no one stop this? The answer is usually, people noticed pieces, but no one put the pieces together. When the neglect becomes crime, why the system misses it. Let's shift gears and talk about the law, because behind every tragic case of starvation, there's a legal system trying to define, prevent, and punish these acts. And when we talk about neglect, control, and isolation, we're not just describing disturbing behavior, we're describing actions that have real legal consequences.
In the United States, laws exist at both the state and federal levels to protect vulnerable people, like children, adults with disabilities, elders, to protect them from neglect and abuse. These laws, they set out what caregivers must do, what counts as neglect, and how authorities should respond if someone crosses the line.
At the most basic level, every state has statutes requiring caregivers to provide food, shelter, medical care, and safety. Failing to meet these duties isn't just morally wrong, it's a crime. But the law doesn't stop at simple neglect. When the neglect becomes chronic, deliberate, or leads to serious harm, prosecutors can escalate charges from neglect to criminal neglect to manslaughter or even murder.
And we all know where we stand on that one.
For sure.
So why does it matter how the law classifies starvation, whether it's neglect, manslaughter, or murder? Well, because each step up the legal ladder reflects how seriously society takes these crimes and how much responsibility we place on the caregivers.
Think about it. Neglect isn't just forgetting to pack a lunch. It's a pattern of failing to meet somebody's basic needs, sometimes over months or years. The law starts here, treating neglect as a crime because it puts the vulnerable at risk.
But when neglect becomes chronic, when a caregiver repeatedly ignores medical advice, isolates the victim, or controls their access to food and water, the law recognizes this isn't just a mistake, it's criminal neglect. Prosecutors, they look for patterns. Did the caregiver know the risks? Of course they did.
Mm-hmm.
Did they have opportunities to get help and just choose not to?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
If that neglect leads to death, the stakes get even higher. The law asks, was this a tragic accident, or did the caregiver's actions show reckless disregard for life? That's where manslaughter comes in, punishing the people who should have known better and didn't act. There is no tragic accident in starving somebody to death, at least not in the cases that we have seen. They were all willful.
Yeah, I don't see how you could possibly accidentally starve someone to death.
No.
If there's evidence that the caregiver intended harm, obviously they intended harm, but
Right.
allegedly intended harm,
Right?
maybe for financial gain or out of desire for control, well, the law calls that murder because it's murder.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the harshest charge. It's reserved for cases where the starvation is used as a weapon. It's not just a failure.
This escalation matters because it shapes how cases are investigated, prosecuted, and sentenced. It sends a message. Society won't tolerate caregivers who turn neglect into cruelty. The law isn't just about punishment. It's about protecting the vulnerable, demanding accountability, and making sure those tragedies aren't ignored.
So, when we talk about these cases, we're not just telling stories. We're showing how the legal system tries to draw the line between neglect and murder. And while that line matters for justice,
In most states, the law doesn't require a caregiver to intend to kill someone in order for them to be charged with homicide. What is required is a legal duty of care and a failure so extreme that death becomes a foreseeable outcome. The concept everything hinges on is duty of care. If you are legally responsible for someone, a child, a disabled adult, an elderly parent, the law says you must provide the basic necessities: food, water, medical care, and supervision. And when those things aren't provided, it's neglect. But when the deprivation is prolonged, deliberate, or reckless, many states allow prosecutors to escalate the charge.
it's so crazy we even have to have these laws. It's just basic morality.
Right?
Some states explicitly define felony deprivation or criminal neglect when a caregiver knowingly withholds necessities over time or ignores obvious risk to serious harm. Minnesota's statute is a clear example, but similar language exists across the country. I mean, that's the doorway prosecutors use to move from neglect to manslaughter and sometimes murder.
Prosecutors don't wake up and randomly decide to file homicide charges in neglect cases, although they kind of should in the starvation case. They look for patterns. They ask, was this person completely dependent? Was food or medical care available but withheld? Did the caregivers isolate the victim from oversight? Did the caregiver ignore repeated warning signs? Was the harm predictable?
Intentional, 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 intentional.
That's homicide. If the answer to those questions is yes, then neglect starts to look a lot less like failure and more like reckless disregard for life. Or homicide. I just don't understand why the law seems so
we're
like...
gonna keep pushing our opinion on this point here. Homicide.
Right. Neglect's not... Yes, neglect is failure. But it's not like... This is not like we keep saying, like, it's not like they didn't pack a meal. They didn't feed people for days and weeks and months.
One of the biggest shifts that's happening right now in the legal system is the recognition that starvation is not passive, like we've been talking about. Legally, withholding food is considered an act not just of mere omission. Like, when the caregiver is able to provide it but chooses not to, that's intentional abuse. Courts are increasingly rejecting the idea that you have to strike someone to kill them. This matters because it reframes starvation as something done to someone, not just something that happened. This framing shows up again and again in sentencing language, especially when the judge talks about, like, foreseeability. If someone loses half their body weight over months or years, death is not a surprise.
In every single one of these cases, no one can argue that the death wasn't foreseeable, given how little everyone weighed.
Yeah, they were literally emaciated.
Yes. I mean, a 7-year-old weighing less than a newborn. How do you not know that's not going to lead to death? Like, there's no way that they didn't know what they were doing. So now here's where the systematic failure comes in. Because if the law is capable of addressing it, why does it often intervene so late? The biggest reason is that the systems are designed to catch acute harm, not slow harm. Child Protective Services and Adult Protective Services often respond to individual reports, not long-term patterns. Chronic neglect is notoriously hard to quantify, and reports tend to be treated as isolated incidents rather than part of an escalating trajectory. So a missed appointment here, a low weight there, a concerning home visit, doesn't quite cross a threshold. All of it gets logged, but not necessarily connected.
Another major failure is, like, fragmentation. In many of these cases, different systems have, like, little pieces of the puzzle. You know, schools notice absences, doctors notice weight loss, home health agencies track hours, child services agents make visits, but those systems don't always, like, communicate effectively with each other. Like, in Kedris Maddox's cases, multiple people raised concerns, but no one had authority or urgency to pull everything together in time.
We also can't ignore the role of resource constraints. CPS and APS agencies are often understaffed and overwhelmed. That leads to what researchers call threshold culture. Cases are only escalated when they become undeniably catastrophic. By the time starvation is obvious enough to meet that threshold, the damage is already done. Research consistently shows that chronic neglect cases are among the hardest for agencies to manage because they don't present as emergencies until the very end.
Right, there aren't all the bruises and stuff that you normally see in the abuse cases. So there's a disability blind spot in many systems. When the victims are disabled, like weight loss, isolation, and withdrawal, they're really often like misattributed to their condition rather than recognized as red flags. So their disability can be used, whether it's intentional or not, as an explanation that like dulls the urgency. Prosecutors and judges have increasingly pushed back against this, but the frontline systems are often lagging behind. That's why the judge in Wisconsin explicitly said that the disability made these cases more aggravated, not less.
The reason you're seeing more homicide charges and starvation cases now is that courts are catching up to what psychologists have been saying for years. Chronic neglect kills. There's a growing recognition that caregiver-perpetrated homicides are not a rare abnormality, but they're predictable outcomes of certain patterns: isolation, control, prolonged deprivation. That shift is slow, uneven, and often reactive, but it's happening.
The legal system can hold people accountable, but it often does so only after the worst possible outcome. What these cases show over and over and over again is that starvation isn't invisible. It's just easy to ignore when systems are, when they're overworked and they're trained to look for bruises instead of patterns. And until that changes, the law's going to keep arriving too late.
So when we ask, when does starvation become murder? The real answer is uncomfortable. Legally, it's when the system finally decides to see it.
So wrapping up, we've walked through 6 cases in this episode. Different states, different families, different victims. But when you line them up side by side, the similarities are impossible to ignore. These weren't like chaotic moments of violence. There was no single explosion. There was no collapse one day. What happened in every single one of these cases was slow, incremental, predictable, and that's what makes it so hard for people to process.
Because we're taught to think of murder as something active, loud, immediate, but starvation doesn't work that way. Starvation works quietly. It happens one missed meal at a time, one canceled appointment, one decision not to intervene, one excuse layered on top of others until the outcome feels inevitable. Like it just happened, but it didn't just happen.
I feel like we always want to give caregivers the benefit of the doubt too, and that's...
And in most cases, they do deserve it. And as we said, burnout's real. But that is an excuse for anyone to starve anyone.
It's obviously chronic. What these cases show is that neglect doesn't become deadly all at once. It becomes deadly when control replaces care. These were different stories, but they share the same pattern. And that pattern is 3 repeating pieces: isolation, rationalization, and silence. Isolation keeps the outsiders from seeing what's happening. Rationalization gives caregivers permission to do nothing. And silence, by families, systems, and institutions, let it continue. And by the time the law steps in, it's often too late.
That's why the legal question, when does neglect become murder, matters so much. Legally, the answer is when deprivation is prolonged, when harm is foreseeable, and when someone with the duty of care chooses not to act. But normally, the line is crossed much earlier. It's crossed the moment someone realizes a dependent person is deteriorating and decides to explain it away instead of stopping it.
And this is where the system failures really come into focus. In almost every case we talked about, there were moments where intervention was possible. A missed doctor's visit that could have been flagged. A wait that should have triggered an alarm. A home visit that didn't really connect all the dots. A report that was treated as, just an isolated incident instead of part of a pattern. The system isn't built to catch slow harm. It's built to respond to emergencies. And starvation doesn't look like an emergency until the body can't compensate anymore.
Which leaves us with an uncomfortable truth. These deaths weren't unpredictable. To which again we say, No duh. They were unaddressed. And that's why the courts are starting to call them what they are. Not accidents, not misunderstandings, not caregiver burnout, but crimes.
There's a tendency, especially when disability is involved, to soften the language. To say, it was complicated, or it was overwhelming, or they didn't mean for this to happen. But the law is increasingly saying that this isn't the point. Responsibility is. When someone can't feed themselves, they can't advocate for themselves, they can't escape their environment, responsibility doesn't fade just because it's hard. It becomes heavier.
So when we ask, when does starvation become murder? The answer isn't found in one moment or one statute. It's found in patterns. Patterns of control, patterns of isolations, patterns of choosing inaction when action is required. That's when neglect stops being passive, and that's when it becomes lethal.
And if there's one thing we hope that you listeners take away from this episode, is that starvation is violence. It just wears a quieter mask.
So what do you do? If you're a neighbor, a friend, a teacher, a family member, a medical professional, someone on the outside, trust that feeling when something doesn't sit right. Starvation rarely happens without warning signs. Those signs just don't always look traumatic.
And if you're struggling as a caregiver and you feel yourself pulling away, isolating, or rationalizing, help is not a failure. Silence is. There are resources available to help you, and don't hesitate to use them. Please.
These stories are hard to hear, but they matter, because the line between neglect and murder isn't theoretical. It's lived, and too often, it's crossed quietly.
Thank you for joining us today on Seriously Sus. This was a tough episode to get through, and if it made you uncomfortable, that's not a bad thing. Discomfort is often where awareness starts, and awareness saves lives, so stay aware, stay skeptical, and stay sus.
You've just tuned in to Seriously Sus with Miranda and Nanette, your ultimate source of sus with side-eye. Thanks for hanging out with us today. If this episode made you think, hit that like button, subscribe, or follow Seriously Sus for more deep dives into crime trends, drama, and cultural chaos. And remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay sus.